Alright, welcome to part 5, the more complicated part, the mouse input. So in the last video, we did the keyboard input. So now we're going to be working with our mouse and doing player look script. So we'll come over here to our mouse input script. And so now we have similar, you'll see something very similar to what we had before, start and update. And in this case, we want to grab the keyboard inputs, or the mouse inputs. So in this case, we're going to create, just like we did before, a vector2 called mouse axis. And so the mouse axis here is going to, so we're going to get the mouse axis. So mouse axis dot x equals input dot get axis, and then we're going to call this mouse x. So if I go back over here to the Unity, just to show you real quick, I go to edit, just like I did for the other one. Edit, project settings, input. You'll see that there's a mouse x and a mouse y input. Now, these values, the mouse x and mouse y, don't get the mouse position inside the window. So it doesn't find me 0, 0 if I go to the corner here, and it doesn't find me 800 by 800 if I go up to this corner. Instead, it finds the change since the last update. So if I move the mouse really fast, the value will be a lot higher than if I just move it very slowly. It's the amount changed since the last update, and that's important to know. So this is just the mouse changed since the last update. Similarly, we're going to do the mouse y value and then change the axis to mouse y. Now you might be asking why I didn't do an if conditional with the inputs for this, and that's because later, in a later tutorial, I'll talk about controller inputs, and when we talk about thumbstick inputs, we'll have to talk about dead zones. And so this is important for a dead zone. As a keyboard controller, I know that when none of the keys are pressed, that the value is 0. But what ends up happening is when I want to add a dead zone, I would do, instead of doing this, I would do greater than or equal to the dead zone. But in this case, I know that it's 0, so I can just say does not equal 0. If it's anything other than 0, it's being used. In this case, the reason I do it this way is because I want to make sure that these are 0 if the mouse is not moving at all. So you lose sensitivity if you do like a doesn't equal 0. So it's just personal preference for me for mouse axis. If I was using a controller input for the look script, I would do dead zone inputs just like I do with the keyboard or with the controller for the movement. But in this case, it's not completely necessary. Now, I'm also going to add 2 public values before we get started. This one's going to be the mouse X sensitivity. Now, we're going to set this to 1 for now. We don't need it to be anything. This is a float. Mouse X sensitivity. And then similarly, we're going to have a mouse. Whoops. I knew this was going to happen during the stream. A mouse Y sensitivity. So the X sensitivity and the Y sensitivity basically mean similar to what we did for with the movement force, is that this is going to increase the value of whatever comes out of axis, mouse axis X and mouse axis Y. But in this case, we're doing it over in the mouse input class because it's not. It's only to the mouse. It's specific to the mouse. I wouldn't need controller sensitivity to be changed in this class. I would need controller sensitivity to be in the controller class. in this case, because this is mouse specific, whereas movement force was player specific. So all inputs, so controller, touchscreen, anything, I want the player to move at the same rate of speed regardless of my input. However, with mouse input, I may want to manipulate the sensitivity for the mouse differently than I do for a controller. So in this case, we're putting it in the mouse input class. So we're going to multiply this by mouse X sensitivity, and then multiply this by the mouse Y sensitivity. And so now we have that. So similarly to how we have keyboard input, we're also going to want to get our player movement. So we're going to grab a player object, and then player equals this dot get component player movement. Something I do want to cover while we're talking about retrieving the player movement is something called a require component. So right up here above the class, we can attach something called require component, and we can make it a type of player movement. So what does this mean? So let me pop back over in the editor and create a new empty object, right? In this case, it's going to be called game object. Now, I take the mouse input and drag it to our brand new game object that we just created. You'll notice that it also attaches a player movement script. That's because player movement is required by mouse input. Now if I try to remove the component, it'll give me an error that says I can't remove player movement because mouse input requires that it exists. So in this case, we can add that also to our keyboard input because we need the we know as a fact that we need the player movement in order for the keyboard input to function. So now that we have our require components and we know that it's getting the correct component, player, we can then go down here just like we did before, player send message. Now in this case we don't know what the name is. So let's name our new method that we're going to create in player movement, and we're going to call it turn. So this method is going to take a vector 2 of mouse axis, in this case the turn axis, and it's going to turn that into up and down and left and right turning for us. So we're going to pass it our mouse axis, and then just like before we have our send message options, and we're going to require that our player movement has the turn method. Now if I were to run it right now, this would send a turn message and throw me an error saying that player movement does not have a turn method. So we have to make sure that we add one. So I'm going to do a public void turn. That's going to take a value of vector 2, and then this is going to have a this is going to take a turn axis. Alright, I have to take one quick break and I will be right back.